Well, I was watching a movie one day, and the story was set in around World War II time. And during the war, there was a plane that got shot down and crashed in behind enemy lines. Well, there were some survivors, and the survivors knew they needed to get back out of enemy territory to the neutral zone. And there was a neutral zone. They knew if they got it there, that the planes would patrol, and they might be able to be saved. And so they began their hike, their long, dangerous hike. They were trying to stay hidden and trying to move as quickly as they could. Finally got to the neutral zone and waited. A few days went by, and finally they heard a plane in the distance. But the big question is it one of ours? And so they waited, and as the plane got closer, they discovered it is. And they all started shouting and celebrating. It's ours, we're saved. And they were excited, and they were congratulating each other, and totally makes sense that you would celebrate because their lives were saved. Now, as Christians, we have an even greater salvation. We have even more to celebrate because a day of judgment is coming. The wrath of God will be poured out against sin. But God's people, people of faith, people who have put their trust in Jesus will be saved. And that is good news. That is reason to celebrate. In Isaiah, he talks about both the bad news, the judgment is coming, and the good news, there is salvation. Well, today we're going to look at a large section of Isaiah. If you look at there, it says 13 to 28. We're not going to look at every single bit of it. So it's a large section. So it's going to be a little different. First of all, we're going to do this kind of like a flyover summary. And then we're going to come back and land in a few places. All right, so we just want to get the big picture of what Isaiah is talking about, and then we'll sit down in a couple passages. So to begin with our overview, the majority of what we see in these chapters is a series of judgment oracles or prophecies. They are not in chronological order, they're more thematically arranged, but they have a bunch of prophecies of judgment. But we also see in this section that it looks forward to the establishment of God's kingdom. At 2 points, there are judgment prophecies against Jerusalem or Judah or Israel. But most of these chapters deal with other nations, non-Jewish, non-Israel nations. And this is an important thing for us to catch. You see, until now in our study of Isaiah, Isaiah has mostly been talking to Israel or Judah. But now there is a whole lot about non-Israel, other nations. And so it's very clear that God not only judges the sins of Israel, but the sins of the entire world. All people are accountable to God. But these passages, these chapters are also, it's not all about judgment. We will also see that God will save those who believe in him and trust in him. And again, it's not only the people of faith from Israel who will be saved, but people of faith from every nation, from all over the world will be saved. And God will be worshiped from all over the world. And so let's run through this. Starting in chapter 13, we have this vision of Babylon being destroyed and the power of Assyria being broken. But within these prophecies about Babylon and Assyria, there is also clear allusion to worldwide judgment and to Israel being restored and finding rest and coming in the land and rising to a place of prominence in the world. And now these prophecies, they looked forward to some events that, from our perspective, have already taken place in history. Like Assyria being defeated by the Babylons being defeated by the Medo-Persians. But these prophecies also look forward to a greater fulfillment. The initial fulfillments that have happened in history foreshadow the ultimate day of the Lord, the day of God's worldwide judgment on sin. And by the way, if you want to jump forward to the end, the book of Revelation talks about this as well. But I want to read just a little bit here from these chapters so you get a feel for this, for what Isaiah is saying. And also notice as we read this, the wording, how it is speaking of worldwide judgment. So chapter 13, verse 6 through 11 says, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near, as destruction from the Almighty will come." This does not sound good. Verse 7, "Therefore all hands will be feeble and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflamed. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless." Now turn over to chapter 14, verse 26 and 27. He says, "This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. This is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back?" So we get the picture there. Not good, and we're talking about a universal, worldwide judgment. But Isaiah prophesies then against the Philistines at the end of chapter 14. And he says that at a time when the Philistines were actually celebrating that their oppressor has been wiped out, they are warned judgment is coming upon you as well. And then chapters 15 and 16, they tell of the destruction of Moab. And if you remember, Moab they are distant relatives of Israel. They are the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. But Moab will be quickly destroyed. Look what it says in 15:1. He says, "An oracle concerning Moab, because Ar of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone." So we get this picture of a very quick destruction coming upon them. All their pride and their wealth are gone. And then we're told that the survivors will run away, but then they're going to be met by a lion who attacks them. And this lion could be a literal lion, or it could be figurative for another army that's going to come and attack them. But the point is very clear. There's no getting away from it. And they're told, though, that their only hope, so there is hope, but they're told that their only hope is to turn to Judah and to the Davidic king, the king who is a descendant of David, which also implies that they are turning to God, Judah's God, trusting in Judah's God, the one true God. And then it talks about this king, that a good, faithful, and loving king from the line of David will rise up. And this may in part refer to Hezekiah, who was coming after this prophecy was given, but it ultimately looks forward to the perfect Davidic king, the Messiah, to Jesus. And so, again, we're seeing here that people, even non-Israelites, non-Jews, can look to Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, the descendant of David, for refuge and for freedom. Well, next comes a prophecy against Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you remember, Israel had foolishly turned from God, and they put all their trust in what? Their alliance with the Syrians. So together, the two of us will be strong enough idea. But they're told here that they both will be devastated. But this judgment will end up having a positive result. Look at chapter 17, verses 7 and 8. So there's all these words of judgment, and then this comes. Verse 7, in that day man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, to the work of his hands, and he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. And so he's saying that people here are going to turn to the true God, and they are going to worship him alone. Then chapter 18 prophesies God's judgment on Cush. Cush is modern-day Ethiopia, so to the south of Egypt. But this judgment is pictured like a gardener coming through and pruning a plant and cutting off all the overgrowth. But in the end, people from Cush will bring tribute to God and will honor God. And then chapter 19 begins with an oracle about great and mighty and prosperous Egypt. But we're told that a day is coming when they won't be great or mighty or prosperous. Because see, their false gods will be shown or demonstrated to be powerless, because they are. And their wise people, their leaders, their rulers, and their fortune tellers will be made to look like fools, because they will have no answers. And then the Nile River will dry up so that all the lush land around the Nile will become dry and parched. And they won't have good fishing, and they won't have good crops. But then there's this amazing result that comes from God's judgment. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Well, then the following chapters, there's more prophecies of judgment. There's prophecies against Egypt and Cush, against Babylon, against areas or groups of people that live in the Arabian desert, against Jerusalem, against Tyre and Sidon, which are cities on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And then it speaks of judgment on the entire earth. And then in chapter 28, it tells us of two things. It tells us of judgment on those who refuse to listen to God, and secondly, of deliverance for God's faithful remnant. So judgment on those who reject God, deliverance for those who believe and trust in him. So there's our overview. We see judgment, we see salvation, and a kingdom. Now let's go back to chapter 19. And we'll begin in verse 16. Chapter 19, verse 16. So we saw before this that all this talk of judgment coming. In verse 16 it says, in that day the Egyptians will be like women and tremble with fear before the hand of the Lord of hosts, before the hand that the Lord of the hosts shakes over them. And the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear, because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has purposed against them. So, at one time, Egypt was the greatest power on earth. At the time that Isaiah wrote this, they were one of the two greatest powers on earth. It was them and the Assyrians. Now, the Egyptians, they worshiped many things as gods that were not God. And they rejected and opposed the one true God. We can see an example of that in the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were taken out of Egypt. But we see here that along with the first part of the chapter, that these verses explain God's judgment that's coming upon Egypt. But Isaiah says something interesting. He says here that the land of Judah will become a terror to them, to the Egyptians. Now, he's not really saying that they're going to be afraid of the nation or the army of Judah per se. But the land of Judah here represents the place that God dwells. Because you remember, God has talked about that it was his land, and that he would make his presence dwell in a special way in the temple. And so we're talking here about the land where God dwells. It's his land, the temple's there. So it's God who is going to become a terror to the Egyptians. In other words, when they realize that God is bringing judgment upon them, they will be terrified, and with good reason. Well, then he continues to say that the Almighty God has a plan. He says that he has purposed this against them, and nothing can stop it. You see, God will do what he has purposed. And another thing that makes this point even stronger and more fearful for those who it's purposed against is the name that they use for God here. The name that's used for God here is Lord of Hosts, or Yahweh Sabaoth. This name refers to God's supreme power as the leader of the angelic armies, the Lord of Hosts. This name came into use during or after the conquest. You know, when God told Israel, go take the land, and God fought for his people, Israel. And this name is often used in the context of battle. Let me give you an example. In 1 Samuel 17:45, it says, then David said to the Philistine, now who's the Philistine? Goliath. So this is when Goliath has been taunting the Israelites and their God and saying, you can't do anything. Can't anyone come face me? David said to him, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of Hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, the God of the armies of Israel whom you have defied. And so if this God has purposed to come against you, it's a fearful thing. And at this point, as we read this, it may be assumed that his purpose is only to punish sin. But as we read on, we see that his purpose is bigger than that. And this fear of God can actually have a positive result. Look at verse 18. He says, in that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the city of destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the middle of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of oppressors, he will send them a savior and defender and deliver them. And so we're told here that people in England will turn to the true God and will devote themselves to him. And Isaiah mentions 5 cities here. And now this may just be where the people first turn to God. So it's the beginning of the turning to God. But in these cities, we're told that they will speak the language of Canaan. In other words, the language of the Israelites. They'll be speaking Hebrew. It suggests a new relationship between Egypt and Israel. It suggests, even more importantly, a new relationship between God and Egypt. And the people of Egypt will learn the Hebrew language, the language of God's people, the language that his revelation was written in. But they also will build an altar to Yahweh, the true God, in the middle of Egypt. And they'll build a monument to him at the border. And these will both remind the people of God, of his greatness, and of their commitment to him. And then, when Egypt is threatened by an oppressor, when they are oppressed by some other nation, by an enemy, it says that they will pray to God and he will rescue them. Verse 21. And the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day and worship with sacrifice and offering, and they will make vows to the Lord and perform them. And the Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing, and they will return to the Lord, and he will listen to their pleas for mercy and heal them. So now we're told straight out that there's a new relationship between God and the Egyptians. They have a relationship with God. See, years earlier, God had powerfully made himself known to Egypt, but they rejected him. In that day, the day that Isaiah is talking about, God will again powerfully make himself known. And when he makes himself known to them, they will then believe in him. And they will put their trust in him, and they will commit themselves to him. And they will worship him, and they will live for him, live in a relationship with God, like Israel. And when they disobey, God will discipline them, and then they will return to obedience. And God will hear their prayers and will help them. That sounds like a good relationship. That's a positive thing. Let's continue reading verse 23. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. So, in Isaiah's day, Egypt and Assyria were enemies. Again, they were the two great powers of the world. And now, we're talking here about them coming together. And there was a time in history when they kind of got along, but not close like what is mentioned here. And it was short-lived. And so this prophecy hasn't yet been fulfilled. It looked forward to a time when there is complete peace between the nations, and those nations will worship God together. Now you might say, wait, if it hasn't been fulfilled, the Assyrians, they no longer exist as a nation. So what's going on here? Well, Egypt and Assyria were the great powers of the earth at the time, in Isaiah's day, and so they represent the powerful nations of the world. And so this ultimately looks forward to God's rule over all nations. And that those nations, the powerful nations, and all nations, along with Israel, will worship God and will be called, catch this, my people. That was a special name God used of Israel. But he says here that all these people, Egypt will be called my people. So not just Israel, but all people will have this relationship with God. Well, let's look at another passage that continues this idea of worshiping together. Chapter 25. But before we read 25, I want to back up and quickly look at some things from chapter 24 so we can get the context. So 24, verse 1 starts this way. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priests, and with the slave, so with his master, and with the maid, so with her mistress, and as with the buyer, so the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the creditor, so with the debtor. The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and withers, the world languishes and withers, the highest people of the earth languish, the earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the law, they have violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant, in which they have disobeyed God. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. And so we have here a picture that all the earth will be judged. And when he talks about the different people like the slave and the master, he's saying God's not going to discriminate based on social standing. So if you think you're just really important, that doesn't make you avoid God's discipline or God's judgment on sin. But all people are judged because of their sin, because they disobeyed God. Well, jump down to verse 16. Start in the middle of verse 16. It says, But I say, I waste away. I waste away, woe is me, for the traitors have betrayed with betrayal, the traitors have betrayed. He's getting poetic about it here. Verse 17, terror and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. He who flees the sound of the terror shall fall into the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. And so, this sounds bad, right? And if it was not for God's gracious intervention, this coming judgment would be inescapable. You hear something terrible, you run, you fall into a pit, you climb out of the pit, you fall into the trap. It's inescapable if it not for God's gracious intervention. Of course, this makes me think of John chapter 3, verses 16 and 18. I'm going to read that for you. It says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. But whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. You see, these verses are telling us that without Jesus, there is no hope. We are all sinners. We all deserve judgment and death. But God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross to take the punishment for us so that we could be set free, forgiven, made right with God. But without Jesus, we are hopeless. Judgment is inescapable. Thank God for sending Jesus. And one of my favorite verses, Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. If you put your faith in Jesus, you are delivered, freed. There is terrible judgment coming, but not for those who believe in Jesus. Verse 21. Where am I? He said, on that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of the earth on earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days will be punished. He's saying on that day, God, he will defeat those who oppose him, both in the spiritual realm, demonic, angelic beings, and those of humanity. In verse 23, it says, then the moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before the elders. This is actually a cool picture. You see, when the sun and the moon were created, God said that they were there to do what? To rule the day and the night. They were the great lights to rule the day and the night. But here it's saying they're ashamed, kind of like they're humbled, humiliated. The idea here is that they were created to rule the day and the night, but now they're pictured as giving up their rule and submitting to God, to the Lord of hosts. Submitting to their Creator, who is much greater than they are and rules over all. Okay, now we get to chapter 25. Chapter 25, verse 1 says, O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. So this is a song of praise for God from his people in response to his protection. God has put down the enemy, and he has established his rule over all, and those who are saved are worshiping him. Now, this is, again, looking forward to a time when God's people have experienced his salvation and are praising him. So they praise him for the fact that he made a plan and he carried it out, that he was faithful to what he said he would do. And if God says he's going to do something, he's going to do it, right? We know that because it's a certain thing, because God is faithful, because he is able to do what he says, and he's truthful. Then there's no power of evil that can stop him. When God declares salvation, it's a sure thing. Keep reading verse 2. He says, for you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The foreigner's palace is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will fear you. Now, no nation is specified here, and so it can be taken here just generally of any great nation, these great cities. But God came against the proud and ungodly nations that oppressed people. And in his judgment, they were thoroughly defeated and will never rebuild or rise to power again. So they're no longer a threat. Now, this is not a surprise, but people of these great nations recognized that God is greater than they are. And they have to submit to his authority. But the amazing thing here is that as a result of God's judgment against the sinful people, some people will recognize God for who he is and will turn to God in faith and worship him. Verse 4 and 5. It says, for you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in his distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against a wall, like heat in a dry place. You subdue the noise of the foreigners as heat by the shade of a cloud. So the song of the ruthless is put down. And so God here, we're told, God delivers his people from their distress. And he is their protector, their salvation, their comfort. And this great deliverance is demonstrated here in these verses by these images of danger and trouble and discomfort being overcome. Verse 6 says, on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, a rich food full of marrow and aged wine well refined. So now God is in place as the king over all, and he throws a banquet for all people. This pictures God's continued providing and blessing of his people in his kingdom. And people from all the nations come together to celebrate his rule. Verse 7 and 8 says, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people will be taken away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So at this time, when God is in his kingdom, at this time, God will do away with humanity's greatest enemy. Death will be no more. So this thing that hangs over every person's head, it'll be gone. No reason to fear death, because it'll be gone. That means the curse of sin will be gone. We all deserve death, and all people die because of sin. But in God's kingdom, sin and death no longer exist. So along with abolishing death, though, God promised that there will also be no more tears. Now, this would include tears of sorrow, of mourning. And this totally makes sense, because if there's no death, then there's no more mourning of loved ones who you've lost. But there's more to it than just that. You see, tears come from many bad things. Tears come from pain, from sadness, from oppression and injustice, from loneliness, from fear, from sickness, from abuse, and I could continue on. But all of these things will be done away with. God will wipe away everyone's tears. And then he also says that there will no longer be any reproach of God's people on all the earth. That means that God's people will never again suffer rejection, disgrace, shame, or humiliation. They will never again be criticized or accused or put down or told that they're not good enough. God's people will never again be mocked or made fun of. And all of this that we're talking about, the end of death, the end of the tears, the end of reproach, this is all certain. How do we know? Because God said so. That's how that verse ends. The Lord has spoken. God said so. Verse 9. It says, it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. You see, on that day, God's people, those who are gathered from all of the earth, will declare their worship for God. They will declare their devotion to God, and they will exclaim, this is our God. In other words, they believe him, and they are committed to him. He is faithful to them as well. They are in a relationship with him. This is our God. And they will say that they have waited for him. In other words, that they trusted in him, and they put their hope in him. You see, they knew that God was sovereign, and they knew that God was faithful, and they knew that he would do what he had said he would do. And even if things looked bad, their hope was in him. Even if things looked unclear, they believed in him and waited on him. And he saved them. You see, it is a fitting response to celebrate and to worship our God. So God's people tell each other here in the end to rejoice, to praise him, to thank him for his salvation. And really, this is what we take away from this section of Isaiah. In the end, people from all nations worship God. When people in faith rightly recognize who God is and put their trust in him, they are saved, delivered from judgment. The judgment that we all deserve. When people recognize who God is, they devote themselves to him and praise him. God is sovereign. God is the Almighty. He is holy and just. He is gracious and kind. He alone is God, and he alone is fully good. And when we understand that, we worship. We worship. Now, I don't have time to dive deeply into this, but I want to read this one more thing from chapter 52. If you turn forward to chapter 52. Beginning in verse 7. Chapter 52, verses 7 to 10. It says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Breaking forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. This is a picture of announcing deliverance from judgment, deliverance from suffering and from a dark place. And there's great joy that comes as a result of getting good news. The good news is that God is coming. God is coming to deliver his people. And our God reigns. In other words, he is the great God. He rules over all, and he saves his people. Now, you might be familiar with this passage because Paul quotes it. The Apostle Paul quotes it, and Paul applies this picture to sharing the gospel. And this is a very fitting application of this passage. Because see, when Christians share the gospel, when a Christian shares the gospel, he or she is declaring God's salvation and declaring that under God's reign, those who believe in Jesus are saved and are secure. God's rule and God's deliverance is good news. And God hasn't forgotten or abandoned his people. And this is amazing. God has come to the aid of sinners, of people who opposed him, people who disobeyed him. God cares for his people. So declare this. Make it known that our God reigns and he saves. But Isaiah also talks about another idea. The idea that when you know God reigns and you know that God saves people from all nations of the world, and that he loves and cares for his people, those people worship him. People who recognize God for who he really is, recognize all that he has done, all that he will do, those people worship him. So declare his glory and his grace. Our God reigns and saves. God has a day. The day of the Lord is coming. And it will be a day of judgment and a day of salvation. And that day is certain. It is coming. What we don't know is when. So, if you are here today and you have never believed in Jesus as your Savior, your sins are not forgiven. That means you stand guilty and you stand condemned before God. And that means judgment is coming. But the good news is you can be forgiven. God has offered salvation. He sent his son Jesus to die on the cross to take the punishment for you so you could be forgiven and have eternal life and know the joy of knowing God, being in a relationship with God. So believe in Jesus. Don't wait. We don't know when this day of judgment is coming. Don't wait. Secondly, Christians, those who have believed in Jesus, if you know someone who has not, if you have someone who you need to share the good news with, do it. And thirdly, if you have put your faith in Jesus, that means your sins are forgiven. Jesus took the judgment for you. The price has been paid, and the day of the Lord will be a day of salvation for you. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Instead, there's grace, forgiveness. You have life and blessing and joy in the presence of our holy and loving God to look forward to. That's good news. God has a day, and it will be good. God has a day, so thank him. Praise him. Worship